As much as I like RPGs, not everything is great. It is inevitable, but there are things in this genre that I despise so much that sometimes I wanna throw them out of the window and never look at them ever again. Yes, this is a top 10 things I don't like about them. I know some may be harsh, but this is my list. Also feel free to share some of the things you don't like about RPGs. And keep in mind that sometimes I am showing random footage. Without further ado, and no particular order, let's begin. One of the things I despise the most in RPGs is arbitrary difficulty spikes. I consider this kind of execution as something of bad taste, or simply poor, but let's define which difficulty spike I mean, because they could be their own thing. If the video game encourages exploration, or if it is an open world with no real direction, I don't mind it, because it is you who's trying to brute force your way in perhaps places where you have no business. If the game gives you enough tools to effectively tackle the challenge, even with those differences in levels, I also don't care. But let's say that the story is completely linear, and suddenly the following boss is like 20-30 levels above you, and you had no way to prepare, or even bring countermeasures for such challenge. That is what frustrates me the most, because that leads to the second thing I despise, which is a forced grinding session. On its own, I don't mind to spend some hours grinding, but when the task becomes a bit too common while playing, it can turn extraordinary playing sessions into an annoying mess. Two examples that always pop on top of my mind are the grinding sessions that were forced in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Yes, I know Monster Hunter doesn't have to be an RPG to be nominated for Best RPG, and yes, I am being sarcastic. In this particular entry, because after each title update you had to spend many hours hunting the same monsters, so you can unlock the neo-afflicted version of them and update your gear. So yep, I hated those days. And in Record of Agarest War, where at the very last stretch of the game, you needed to capture monsters, convert them into materials, upgrade the materials so you can equip extra damage or stuff like that. Then start hunting another enemy for peculiar items so you can forge a weapon that requires another weapon from another weapon from another weapon so you can get a decent damage on the enemies. So once you completed that, the gods can own your sorry arse, because you need to go back and now farm the end game enemies once again. Yep, those are the kind of farming sessions I despise the most. But now let's check the polar opposite, with bad bosses. In my mind, a boss is like a small test. Like, let's check if this dude has the right team composition, equipment, a strategy, or something at least functional. On its own, I enjoy a good challenge. I don't mind if I end up dying several times, but those fights where the boss appears, you start to listen to that killer soundtrack, and as they appear they die. For me, these encounters ruin the experience. The so-called boss was turned into another common mob. Heck, it is confusing when the mob out there owns your team, but the boss is just another walk in the park. And these moments are way worse when the last boss doesn't feel like a boss at all. Sometimes I understand that people want to finish the game quite fast, and they don't care if it was a quick fight. But for me, if the common boss is a test, the last boss is the whole semester recap in 1 hour. And here we can jump into bad endings. Now this one can be extrapolated to other genres out there, but in general RPGs are known for the way the story is handled, taking care of the lore, how the main character gets to know the party members, and how they have to beat countless challenges where they have to move heaven and earth to fulfill their task. Ironically, the end is something trivial. I can't understand it because sometimes going back and forth in the sketchboard trying to tie everything up is complicated, so I give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes. But there is a limit to that kind of things, because sometimes they are just lazy or bad jokes, where they feel like you lost several hours of your time in a pointless story. In the next spot we can find mandatory quests. I know there are games where they are quest driven, and I have no issues with that. I mean, that is the main base of the game. But let's face it, sometimes there are quests that are not even entertaining to complete, but they are forced. And on top of everything, they don't reward the player with something meaningful, so it feels like a waste of time. going out there and looking for a rare item that is dropped by a peculiar enemy that appears under specific circumstances. And on top of everything, that item has 0.5% of chances to be dropped. Now there are other cases where you have but a small time window to finish a particular quest. Oh, but guess what? It was a chained quest where you needed to rescue a cat. But because you didn't want to do it as your first task, now you are forbidden to look at the true ending. Sácate con tus mamadas, Mary Jane. Another thing that grinds my gears is when the video game is unnecessarily long. And this can be achieved by a lot of reasons. But for me, it can be a poor combination of a lot of sub-events, quests, filler, grinding that doesn't feel rewarding in one way or another, or stuff like that. Now this is quite subjective, because sometimes people want to have all of the previous things included in their games. But let's face it, sometimes they are unnecessary. Now I wanna be clear, that if the game has interesting things to do, I don't mind to spend over 100 hours playing it. And that is the reason why I say poor combination. Because sure, you can mess up some quests or conversations, or turn them in trivial, immature settings, but when they become a bit too frequent, that is another thing. This also leads to unnecessarily long intros. Then again, this is something subjective, but sometimes they are way too long. If it is the continuation of a story, I don't mind, because sometimes there is a decent gap in years between one game and another. So I am happy to get a refresh of what is the state of affairs, but if it is a fresh beginning, things can be handled better. Having some conversations, but also letting the player know how is the gameplay going to be, and stuff like that. Let's say 1 hour of scenes, dialogues, and 1 hour of gameplay. But sometimes it is 3 hours of reading, 30 minutes gameplay. So you can read another 2 hours, then play 1 hour. Yep, sometimes RPGs are unfriendly as heck. This unfortunately can lead to something that can be nerve-wracking in some moments, which are tutorials. Let's dive into different executions. Now, to be fair, there are games that are so freaking complex that they effectively need tutorials, but I like the idea of leaving them out of the game, like in something like tips and tricks section. So if you're interested, you can go and read the topic you want to know. One example of that is experiencing. In general, you can read the whole tutorial of those games at any moment. Read the difference between classes, how to proceed in the game, formations, status ailments, etc. And it is at hand's reach. However, there are other games that definitely need a tutorial, like Xenoblade Chronicles X. This game can be really complex at times, and in some battles I will say that it is imperative to know what is the real difference between some skills. Another example of a game that can be annoying as heck is EVE Online, because this is a game where before you get down to business, you need to read hours upon hours. Otherwise, good luck, my draw. The 9th thing in the list is unpolished mechanics. I know that sometimes devs want to bring love letters to the table, but one thing is bringing a love letter and another thing is using the copy-paste and call it a day. Now I place these two examples because I have talked about these two companies and a peculiar thing they have in common, which is wizardry. Yep, the grandpa of all you know about RPGs. One broke a classic love letter, and I respect that. But years later they bring the same love letter with another setting, and no real improvement on its execution. While the other, sure, missed the mark at first, but as time passed, they have delivered solid wizardry-like games, with polished mechanics. And there are others where they combine so many things in between, where they lose focus of what was important in between. And last but not least, really high random encounters. On their own, if properly balanced, I don't care about them. Sure, sometimes I wanna get across some sections kinda fast, but it doesn't happen that often. However, there are games that suddenly increase random encounters to a point where you take a step and you get an encounter, another step and another encounter, another step and another encounter. Add hard gameplay, and congrats, you achieved a terrible combination, which ironically happens at the very end of the game, like a form to punish the player, the beginning of a masochist test, where it is your ego against the dumb game. In general, I could say that these are the 10 things I despise the most while playing RPGs. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.